Hello, everybody. Welcome to the New York State Trustee Handbook Book Club. I'm one of your hosts, Ron Kursop, and tonight we'll be discussing what's new with the 2023 edition of the Trustee Handbook. It looks like this if you see me on your screen. Hopefully you've seen either a physical copy of it, or we'll drop the link in chat for the online version so you can take a look at it. The purpose of the New York State Trustee Handbook Book Club is to provide explanations and insights for the more than 6,000 library trustees in New York State. Each book club session takes a deeper dive into one of the chapters of the Trustee Handbook. However, this time we're going to kind of give an overview of what all the updates are in the Trustee Handbook 2023 version. And we'll also answer real-life questions received from the field in the area of governance work for library boards. Before we get too far into tonight's session, I want to give a quick note about the continuing education certificates. So certificates can only be issued when the Mid-Hudson Library System can verify an individual's participation. Trustees viewing in a group setting, meaning trustees participating under someone else's registration or login, will need to use the self-assurance form provided by the New York State Library, and we'll put the link for that PDF in the chat as well. Credit will not be given for partially attended events, so just make sure you stick around for the whole thing. Please keep a copy of this certificate for your records. Mid-Hudson Library System does not keep track or archive attendance records and cannot guarantee that copies of previously issued certificates can be provided. Trustees are responsible for maintaining their own records and reporting their trustee education attendance according to their library's board-approved trustee education policy. I see so many of you have already done this, but if you haven't already, please feel free to drop your name and your library and how long you've been serving on the board in the chat box. And before we get too far, I also want to make sure that we thank our promotional sponsors. And for that, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the New York State Library, the Public Library System Directors Organization, the Library Trustee Association, and the Public Library section of NYLA. We would not have had such a great turnout tonight without these individuals. So for tonight, we will be discussing the content of the 2023 edition of the Trustee Handbook the Handbook for Library Trustees of New York State. And over the next 90 minutes, Rebecca Smith-Aldrich will provide an overview and answer frequently asked questions sent in advance by our viewers. So thank you to everybody who was able to send those in advance. Following that, Brian Hildreth and I will have an open Q&A for anyone who has questions that's in attendance. You can drop those in the Q&A section of the bottom of your screen. You'll see it next to the chat box, Q&A. Please put any questions that you have in there. If last month was any indication of the volume of questions, we might not be able to get to all of them. However, we will take a look at the number of questions we receive after this next few sessions of the Trustee Handbook and maybe do a book club after party after the fact. And since I mentioned the book club after party, if you visit midhudson.org/trustee-book-club, you'll be able to find the January 25th, 2024 after party recording from all of our 2023 book club sessions. So be sure to check that out. I'd also like to thank Laura Crizzy from Mid-Hudson Library System and also my co-moderator, Brian Hildreth from the director of the Southern Tier Library System. And as usual, we are joined this evening by the wonderful Rebecca Smith-Aldrich. Rebecca Smith-Aldrich is the executive director of the Mid-Hudson Library System. And in addition to co-authoring the Handbook for Library Trustees of New York State, she authored the Companion Handbook for the new library directors of New York State, the Municipal Ballot How-To Guide, and 2 books for ALA editions. So many of you have already seen Rebecca Smith-Aldrich talk about a wide variety of topics. I'm really looking forward to hearing what she has to say about some of the updates that are in the Handbook for Library Trustees of New York State. So without further ado, Rebecca, take it away.
Thanks so much, Ron. Thanks for helping us get oriented here this evening. And thank you to everyone who's shown up here tonight to figure out how to read the new handbook as quickly as possible. That's how I've been thinking about this session tonight, where we give you the crib notes of what's actually different from the last version, which was about 5 years ago. So that's our goal here tonight, is to show you the major changes throughout the handbook, as well as some of the highlights there that will be helpful for you to know of things you may have relied on in the old handbook that have definitely changed, whether by law or statute or just the circumstances of the world, which is perhaps the most most of the cases that we're talking about here tonight. There's a wide world that we live in and the context in which we do our work as library stakeholders. And so the trustee handbook is designed to give the trustees of our libraries across the state, honestly, a fighting chance, right? Like you don't know what you don't know. So the handbook is designed to hopefully be an accessible document that is a reference for you during your tenure on the board. So when you've got a question, hopefully you can look it up there. It's not necessarily designed to be read from cover to cover, but certainly I know folks who have. I've gotten some very funny pictures from folks over the past few months who had very seriously read the former version of this document and had post-it notes and notes they'd written in it over the years when they come to different workshops and trainings and things they figured out along the way. And it's like hard to let go of that relic, right? And when you've got the new trustee handbook, but I hope it's around for a few years at least for people to mark up and find useful as you move through your volunteer tenure with your library board. So in good faith, that's what we did here. So try to create something that's helpful to you and helps make your work more fun and easy as you serve your community through your local library. So just to paint the picture here of the depth and really kind of variety of experiences that people are going throughout the state, New York's a big place. We serve a lot of people. There's a lot of libraries, over 750 libraries across the state, just on the public side of things. That's not counting school libraries, academic libraries, and special libraries. But there's over 6,000 of you trustees throughout New York, you wonderful people who step up and volunteer your time to make your community a better place through your local library. And so that's a pretty amazing cadre of people doing really good work on behalf of our communities. And I know you've probably heard me say it before, but it's part of what gives me hope about the future of our world, to really see neighbors coming together to help neighbors. So hopefully you see the impact that you make on a daily basis, but we see the impact you make across regions, right? Ron, Brian, Laura, and I, we work at a library system. I get to watch people across 5 counties do amazing things for their neighbors through their libraries. There's so many people you're impacting. Over 10 million New Yorkers have library cards. That's pretty phenomenal, right? There's not many other things we can point to in New York besides roads and schools that folks are enjoying at that level of usage. And I think a fun fact, perhaps, that we don't often think about, because usually we're advocating for more funds and dealing with chronic underfunding of libraries, is the fact that trustees oversee over $1.3 billion in resources. Whether it's public or private funds, all of it has been dedicated to libraries to be used in good faith to enhance library services for our communities. That is a lot of responsibility for volunteers, right? So you've got your paid staff to help you do this work. Some of you have your paid treasurers to help you do this work. All others of you are in smaller libraries where you're kind of like a DIY shop. You're figuring it out yourself. You're doing your best, and you just need a little help to make sure you do things within the confines of law and regulation. And sometimes that's where the handbook can really come in handy, because again, you don't know what you don't know. So I'd like to start off by first thanking a new group of people that helped out with the newest handbook. We invited an editorial board for the first time ever to help out with the handbook. We used to have like informal conversations with folks and asking certain people to read through various sections to get their take on things and their expertise. This time we formalized it. We wanted to make sure we had a wide, diverse voice across the state from not only trustees, but also folks in oversight agencies, support agencies, and those folks that have been around the block a few times and they've seen some things and really were able to add a lot to the new handbook. You may notice if you have a print copy, it's a bit heftier than the last copy. And I know I will never live it down, that it's gained so much heft. But honestly, there's no excess in there. It's all stuff we feel is really going to be useful to you. And a large part is thanks to the folks on this list who helped Jerry and I think about things from different perspectives, that Jerry and I didn't have certain experiences and they brought that to the table. And I think you'll see reflected in what's new, a number of things that are really helpful and unique and almost a departure from how we did things in the past editions. So let's start by thinking about big picture, overall, what you'll find different throughout the handbook. And this is something we decided to do throughout the handbook. You won't see a specific a chapter on equity, diversity, and inclusion, or a specific chapter on sustainability. These are major themes in our lives today that really touch on so much of what we do through our libraries and the governance of our libraries. So you're going to see in a variety of chapters how we've woven in where there's intersections. As you think through your facilities, we have to think about equitable access, inclusive access to our facilities. When it comes to sustainability, it's not just about your building. It's also thinking about how we contribute to our community's resilience in a variety of ways. So again, you'll see those themes woven throughout the handbook. You'll also see we've made a big effort to integrate another document that Jerry and I created for the New York State Library, which is the Public Library District Toolkit. And even folks who are not library districts should be interested in this, because this is really the primer for how to secure public funding and increase your public funding from your community. So we made sure this is really dovetailed in with the trustee handbook. And those things are mutually, I think, appreciating each other and complementing each other throughout both documents now. So we want those things matching up. So it's reinforcing the work that we've done to help libraries have sustainable funding in New York State or achieve sustainable funding in New York State. But I think you might be more interested even probably in the really specific highlights in the handbook, those things that are really practical, things that are going to apply to kind of your everyday life as a library trustee. So that's where I want to spend the bulk of my time talking to you tonight. And then of course, we'll get to your questions, which is way more interesting than me talking here. But again, this is kind of like your cliff notes of reading the new edition of the handbook. So something super basic, and this is thanks to a number of our folks on the editorial board, is that we often assume that people understand the duties of the officers of a board, and we understand how committees work. But we have found over the years that's not necessarily true. And folks do their best. They follow the models that came before them, and sometimes they follow patterns that work, and sometimes they don't have a pattern to follow and are kind of making it up as they go along. So we gave everyone a starting spot to understand the various roles of the executive committee, president, vice president, and secretary, and the one that we probably have the most fun with, right, the treasurer and or fiscal officer, depending on if you're an association or public library. That may look a little different depending on your type of library. And we can certainly talk more about that if folks have questions, which I bet you do. And then you've got your committees, right? Thinking about how committees really work to serve and expedite the work of your library. If done well, it can really make board meetings go much quicker. It can make sure folks feel more informed about the work they're doing, getting recommendations from their peers who have done the research. These are all things that are very helpful to board operations, but have intersections with other issues that might come up on your board, from how the authority of your committee compares to the authority of your board, how it works with open meetings law, depending on your type of library, what are typical committees that a library should have, or most libraries do have. So here's just some basic starter info on both of those topics. We're going to take a real deep dive on these two areas of content at the October book club session. So I hope you'll save that date and join us for that. We'll go far more in detail on these issues, but now you've got a starter spot in the trustee handbook on these topics. The personnel chapter is not greatly changed, but I would say there's a bigger emphasis on explaining the relationship between the director and the board. That's a question. That's a question topic we get a lot. Who does what? Who takes the lead? Where does that authority lie? And that's an area that can often be gray in some libraries, particularly smaller libraries. So you'll see that not only is that issue actually found in the personnel chapter, we address that in a couple of other areas where that question commonly comes up. There's also an expanded section on boards dealing with staff. What we've seen over the past few years is a much more litigious relationship between staff and boards. And so boards have to be super careful in that relationship with staff. You obviously want to be friendly and open to the staff and make sure they have a great working environment. But very quickly, a conversation with a staff person can overstep the boundaries of the management responsibility of the director, or get into areas that could quickly get you as an individual trustee into some hot water. So there's a little more guidance there on that topic, because we've seen it's become a bit more fraught with potential problems than we've seen in the past. And then you'll see another little change we've made is really emphasizing the importance of the co-evaluation of the co-leadership of the library. We always say that libraries are led in a co-leadership model with the director and the board. And that relationship can be tricky and it's hard to understand sometimes. But as it's always been a best practice to evaluate the director, we also see strength in the self-evaluation of a board. And we talked about that a bit last year during this series. But we've put those two things together and given you resources to help with both of those types of evaluation, to help both sides of the leadership equation feel like they've got what the tools they need and the feedback they need to have that continuous mindset of improvement moving forward. So again, healthy practices for healthy libraries. Now, everyone's favorite topic, open meetings law. There's been a considerable number of changes since the last edition of the handbook, and it was probably the most frustrating thing for me, knowing those handbooks were sitting out there with basically out-of-date information about open meetings law. And I'm sure now that I've said this out loud, they'll have an amendment to open meetings law this legislative session, which hopefully is for the better. But when you think about open meetings law, it's one of the first points of contact for many members of the public who want to know more about your board. And so making sure you understand open meetings law and are following the basics behind it, that's a pretty critical thing to be getting right as a board. So a couple of things that I think have slipped through the goalie and people may have missed over time, noting that any document you're going to discuss does need to be posted to the library's website 24 hours in advance of your meeting, not just available as a handout at the meeting, but actually posted to the library's website. And that's something a lot of boards are not in the habit of doing. There's also a lot of still confusion about the use of video conferencing at library board meetings. We all got very used to video conferencing during COVID, and many of us prefer that, particularly in areas where we're widespread. I know in my system, I have 3,000 square miles, so my trustees drive 2 hours to get to our board meetings. It'd be a lot easier if we were just video conferencing. But there's very specific rules around using video conferencing, and the link that you have on this slide and that Laura's going to put in the chat for you goes to a document from the Committee on Open Government, which is super handy. It really walks you through the process. It explains everything. It gives you a sample resolution to use. Pro tip, you actually have to have a public hearing to vet your policy on this. It's not like a normal policy that you're passing at your board meeting. So it's pretty specific and it's pretty narrow for when you can use video conferencing. And many libraries are opting just to not deal with that and go back to the way things were before the pandemic. May or may not work for your board, but here's the path forward if it's something you do want to introduce into your situation. But really read that document. It should be considered the Bible on how to do that for your library. And then, of course, the area of law that I feel the boards across New York State violate the most is the use of executive session at their board meetings. And so there's more detailed information about how to use that appropriately to both protect the reputation of your library and also to ensure any discussions or decisions you make in executive session are not invalidated by improper use of executive session. I will say again, and I say this every chance I get, I hope that you rarely use executive session. It's really not something that was designed to do the business of the board. It's to protect someone's reputation, a negotiating strategy, or a legal strategy. Those are the three major situations in which executive session makes sense. Outside of that, it might be for your convenience because you're embarrassed to talk about something or uncomfortable to talk about something. But more often than not, executive session isn't always the right choice. So be very, very careful with that. I think it definitely impinges on library boards' reputations when they overuse it. So one of the chapters that was both fun to write and horrifying to write was the risk management chapter. It's actually greatly expanded because of the complicated world that we live in today. Risk management, the chapter when I inherited the trustee handbook, was really focused on fiscal mismanagement and really thinking about the ways trustees can get in hot water if they don't follow best practices for internal financial controls. But the truth is, there's a lot of risks to your library, not just financial or unethical behavior by boards. We have to kind of broaden our definition of risks to the library to encompass some of the unfortunate realities of the world we live in today. So the new chapter on risk management touches on a number of topics that we've unfortunately seen libraries have had to deal with. Of course, public health is no surprise to anybody after surviving through the pandemic as institutions that serve the public. But we're also seeing big issues related to cybersecurity for libraries. I just had a call earlier this week, I guess that was yesterday, Monday, with a library that was, their operations were totally shut down for 3 months because of a ransomware attack. And they just hadn't thought through the steps to A, prevent something like that from happening, but B, having redundancies in place so that it didn't bring their operations to a standstill. So these are new things, new areas that perhaps we're not all used to thinking about, but they are things that can impact the operations of our libraries and people's access to our services. Also, it can erode public trust if we mishandle a number of these things. So I think public safety, as well as the financial integrity and the ethical integrity of our institutions, that's what we tried to really focus on for the new risk management chapter. So if you have been sleeping too much and you would like to not sleep as much, that's a good chapter to read. The planning and evaluation chapter, as you folks know, Ron Kursup, who kicked us off here this evening, he's our planning and evaluation guru, and he helped us greatly as an editorial board member to do a better job on describing the various components of your plan, whether you call it your strategic plan or long-range plan or plan of service. There's some key components in that document that are super helpful to make sure everyone's on the same page and pulling in the same direction, as well as giving you what you need to operationalize your plan and evaluate your plan. So you'll see we took some time to really break each of these ideas into different sections and really explain them. So it's very, very clear how to use that section and how to do it well. The other thing we did in there is we talked about evaluation metrics. That's something that we often like blow right on by, right? We just don't have a lot of time. We'll just kind of all do a gut check. That went well, right? Oh, okay, yeah, I think it's thumbs up. Let's just keep going. But there are some key metrics to be thinking about and measuring against and making sure we're tracking and really thinking about them not out of context, but in context of how we're doing compared to others, how we're doing compared to ourselves over time. What are those metrics or outcomes that actually demonstrate we're making a difference in people's lives? These are all important things for us to consider. So we're not needlessly tracking stats, but we're doing so with purpose and in context of actually telling the story of what we're doing and the impact that we're having. So the access to library services chapter used to be very heavy in talking about facilities and technology. And we've really broadened the idea of access to library services using the equity, diversity, and inclusion lens. Really wanting everyone to feel included at our libraries requires us to think broadly about people's experiences in our communities, whether folks that are differently physically abled or have different learning styles or whose English is not their first language, understanding the demographics of our community. I know here in the Hudson Valley, we have a huge population of folks that hope to age in place. That means all of our library buildings need to be accessible to folks with disabilities or physical impairments. So it's something that can really change a person's life when they're able to get through the doors of your library, access the various services, whether they're through a computer or at a program, and really being empathetic to the human experience as people are born different and age different. And so I think that's something we're really proud of in this edition of the Trustee Handbook, is really trying to think through all the different varieties of the human experience and how that intersects with how we deliver library services. So it gives us a lot to think about, but it's also exciting to know that we're able to be flexible enough to meet the needs of most folks in our community with just a little bit of extra thought towards how we do things and a little bit more empathy maybe than we brought to the table before on these topics. So the infrastructure chapter, which is probably about facilities and technology, those are our primary focus in infrastructure. That's, again, greatly expanded, really thinking more broadly about the role of your facility and the role of technology in both running our libraries and delivering services. Those are really actually two different things, like running the ILS and the front desk of the library. That demands specific technology, perhaps a little different than what you're using for public access computing and Wi-Fi deployment and introducing people to emerging technologies. So we really wanted to broadly think about facility and technology as how it helps us carry out the mission of our libraries, as well as how we contribute in some new ways that I think unfortunately, is an emerging area of thought, which is how do we contribute to resilience in our communities in light of all the potential disruptions we just touched on in the risk management chapter, right? So really thinking about how do you keep that building running no matter what happens, whether it's a hurricane hits our area, we've got flooding, there is an extended power outage, we've got civil unrest in our community. There's some new thinking around how to keep our libraries open and running and able to meet the needs of our community, as well as how technology plays a role in that aspect of future thinking for our libraries. I'll also point out a couple of little things about the technology end. We also spent some time talking about staff training, which is now a minimum standard technology training for your staff. So we fleshed out that part a little bit, and a little more on budgeting for technology, because that looks a lot different than it did in the year 2000. And I noticed the language we were carrying over was really not aging well. So you'll see some new thought around budgeting for tech in that chapter, as well as the promotion of the federal E-rate program. That is a program that I personally feel is vastly untapped by libraries in New York State, and is something that could greatly enhance your budget to tap into and to pay for broadband connectivity, as well as equipment that facilitates that connectivity. So there's a lot of, I think, helpful tips in there that broaden people's thinking about technology and how we deploy it in our libraries. So public relations, a chapter near and dear to my heart. We actually just overhauled this chapter. It was very focused on traditional public relations and advocacy, which you'll of course find in that chapter, but you'll see also this idea of reputation management, which is something that we have to be far more aware of with the introduction of social media into the landscape, both our use of it and other people's use of it. There's also, thanks to Matthew Bollerman, who was on the editorial board, a crisis communication strategy section now, understanding that how we manage communication in moments of crisis sometimes can make or break your reputation, both with your staff and the community. And so having good plans in place, understanding roles before a crisis is really helpful. It really increases the likelihood of things going more smoothly in those very tense moments you might be confronted with. We also introduced a whole partnership section in here because we find that sometimes the most powerful voices about our libraries are not ours. They're the folks who have benefited from our services, who understand the value of our services, and other service providers in our communities who understand the folks they serve love the library, and it enhances their life. So really broadening the number of people in our communities that can be ambassadors of our libraries, not just library staff and trustees and our friends groups, right? We want the biggest circle possible of people who understand libraries, love libraries, and are willing to speak up for them, because that leads into the other two items there: legislative advocacy, particularly at the state level. When we're talking about the budget impact, right now there's a call to action from the New York Library Association to participate in making sure library aid is increased in the final state budget this year, and the importance of association memberships, because those association memberships, for example, to the New York Library Association, is what underwrites a lot of the activity that results in more funds for your system, for the State Aid for Library Construction program, creates new avenues of funding for things that we need to tackle related to digital equity, community resilience work that we were just talking about before. There is certainly money out there. We just have to make sure libraries are thought of when elected officials are creating the programs and pipelines to these fundings. So these are really important components of the overall look at public relations and advocacy. So I think it's a fresh look at the things that are current and how we have to think differently and really more deliberately about a lot of these things. We used to, I think, leave a lot of this to chance, and now we have to really build it into plans, build it into budgets, do things deliberately to participate in public relations and advocacy. It's not optional anymore. So as you can imagine, the intellectual freedom, censorship, and privacy chapter got a lot of attention from the editorial board, the state librarian in particular. We all took a lot of time with this one, given the trends across the country of folks challenging the right to read and some of the items on our shelves, and acknowledging that it's not just about the collection anymore. We're also seeing challenges to programs at libraries. We're also seeing folks getting upset about things that are in our exhibit cases, on our bulletin boards, in addition addition to the 30-year struggle of folks finding stuff on the internet that they find offensive, right? That's been a long-standing area that libraries manage expectations around. So we tried to be more comprehensive in this chapter and recognizing that it's not just about a book on your shelf being challenged. It's about the overall idea of defending the First Amendment, because libraries are seen as government entities, which means you are possibly violating someone's First Amendment rights if you decide to take a book off the shelf, decide to pull back a program that people aren't happy about. It might not just be the politically correct move. It might also be something you have to consider from a legal standpoint. So we wanted to educate folks more about the First Amendment and how there's this massive now intersection within your policies with First Amendment rights. So I think this section is much stronger, and it connects you with so many good resources that are out there now, thanks to our friends at the American Library Association and the Public Library System Directors Organization, which, we pooled our funds to hire a lawyer to write a sample policy for you and a request for reconsideration form. So you don't have to start from scratch or wonder if you're following best practices. We just had a lawyer write it for you, which is a resource linked within the document now for you. I'm sure you heard about it from your system already, but that's another reference point now to run into that and maybe tackle that if you haven't already. So another reminder, if you haven't redone your collection management policy and request for reconsideration form in the past maybe 3 years, that would be a good thing to prioritize this year using some of these resources. The board development chapter, which is a fun one to write. I have to say, over the 25 years that I've been working with library trustees, I just really take pity on you, because I feel like a lot of you end up doing this work without ever having received an orientation or going through an onboarding process at your library to really understand what's going on, the origin documents, how things work, all that stuff that's just like the foundation of knowledge for your library so that you can then do the governance work. So there's nice emphasis on that in the board development chapter, in addition to the full chapter we wrote about orientation for boards. There's a whole chapter just on running orientation and the things that, if your library is not able to do an orientation process for you just yet, how you might do like a self-guided orientation to your library. We also spelled out the trustee education requirement, as you heard Ron's long preamble about getting your certificate of attendance. And I have no illusions that some of you are here today just because you want to check that off early in the year. And I don't take it personally. But again, the information about doing that properly, making sure that we're all clear that this is the sexual harassment prevention training doesn't count towards this. That's a whole separate training mandate that you operate under. And then a really fun section on expanded trustee recruitment, thinking about the diversity of our communities and how do we make sure we're reflecting our communities on our boards. And again, we had Freddie Garcia speak last October. If you didn't get a chance to hear him talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion, it's a good watch. I recommend it highly. He really helped broaden people's thinking about our communities and what diversity really means when we're thinking about diversifying who's on our boards to reflect our community. So we incorporated some of that thinking into the new edition of the trustee handbook. Now, in the last section of the handbook are the appendices. And I took a lot of time in this area because there's so many handy resources there. And I like it because it saves me time when I'm helping libraries to just point them to resources here in the appendix of the trustee handbook. Dwayne from the North Country Library System, he challenged us to make sure the bylaws would work for any type of library. So that's what we did. I rewrote those bylaws to make sure they can work in any type of library situation, public or association. We're going to talk a little more about civil service and the policies checklist in a minute, but of course the public library glossary has been expanded. It's amazing how many acronyms changed or got added or went away since the last publishing of the handbook. So that is expanded and hopefully is kind of a cheat sheet for you as you go through your service as a library trustee. Now, Civil Service 101 is one of those appendices we updated. So you'll see clarification of kind of the language around civil service, which might be very foreign to most folks who were not in their work life serving under civil service. So we really redid it and rethought about it from the perspective of a trustee, not just a regular primer on civil service, but how it intersects with your work as a trustee, primarily in your role of appointing staff and hiring a new director if you fall under under civil service. Again, association libraries do not fall under civil service. You can skip over that portion of the trustee handbook. But for those of you in public libraries, municipal, special district, and school district public libraries, this is your life. So here's a nice starting spot to wrap your mind around the construct and some of the language and how it intersects with your work. Now, I just wanted to share there's a new updated recommended policies list in the handbook. And then here at the Mid-Hudson Library System, Laura, who you met at the top of the hour, and I updated the sample public library policies and policy development tips resource on the Mid-Hudson Library System's website. It matches the list in the handbook. It's divided by the same exact categories. You've got examples from libraries across the state. You can tell if it's from an association library or a public library. And what I did was I curated the sample policies along with reference material. So now you'll see in particular sections reference to the things that we mention support this area, maybe the law that is tied to a policy or guidance from an agency that oversees that policy. So you can find it all in one place on the Mid-Hudson Library System's website. And so Laura and I just want to say you're welcome, because it saves people a lot of time. And we want to thank the libraries across the state who gave us permission to let us use their great policies as examples on that site. So we hope it saves you time and gets you stronger policies at the end of the day. Just to wrap up here, there are some new additions in the appendix. You've got an introduction to sustainability as a core value. That's the newest core value added by the American Library Association. It was added in 2019 and just reconfirmed in January of this year. They actually winnowed down that list to just 5 core values, and sustainability is on there. And so it's one that you can learn more about in the handbook, and we'll also take a deeper dive during this series this year on that topic. We also built out a hiring a library director section. I don't know about other areas of the state, but here in the Mid-Hudson Library System, we've had tremendous turnover in our directors since the pandemic for a variety of reasons. But I've never helped so many boards with hiring a director as I have in the past 4 years. So we've got a little primer on there. And then I'll just give a shout out to a wonderful resource created by the North Country Library System, which we reference right in the appendix there on hiring a library director. Such good information for structuring your search process, and really a great place to go to get started before you call your system for assistance. And then in a final gift in the trustee handbook, Jerry rewrote his pilot payments primer. If you're not familiar with what a pilot payment is, that's payments in lieu of taxes. These are arrangements often made through a county or an industrial development agency in your region to attract business into your area. And often part of the deal that is cut is they make a payment in lieu of paying taxes as an incentive to come into your region. And those payments in lieu of taxes should be going to support the tax-supported entities of that town or region. And often libraries get forgotten about. So educating ourselves about that and making a call to the right agency to remind them about libraries or to help them think of libraries in the future. We watched one of our libraries here in the Mid-Hudson Library System. She took a class with Jerry, learned about this, and said, oh, well, I'm going to call over to our development agency. And the next thing you know, she got a check for $10,000 a year for the next 7 years, which was super handy. So there's, maybe it doesn't work out in your region, but if it did, it could be quite the windfall. So a good thing to learn about and to ask about in your region. So I want to move into the questions. As I said, that's usually the most fun part for us. So I'm going to turn off my screen and turn things over to Ron and Brian to help us surface those questions.
That was a great overview of all the changes for the handbook, Rebecca. Thank you so much. And you have a bunch of people showing you a lot of love in chat. So that's
well, also thank you to Ron and Brian. They were part of the editorial board, and just it's so comforting to have you guys as part of that team, because I know you've been through the fire on a lot of these topics.
So so we're speaking about fire, and we got some really good questions that are coming through tonight, and they're all over the place, which is great because that's what we wanted to do. We wanted to try to hit all different spots of the handbook, and we got questions that are coming in both through the chat and the Q&A. Just as a reminder, as we're kind of going through the next hour, try to put your questions in the Q&A spot of the Zoom portal. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. If you click on that, you should be able to post your questions to that. But Ron and I have been keeping track of questions as they become coming in. So we should be able to pull them from both places. And let's get started with our first question. Can the board use executive session to discuss the process for hiring an executive director? And I think we have some follow-ups to that, but I think we'll just use that question to get us started.
So to discuss the process to hire the director, I would say no. The process itself is not hidden. It's should be public knowledge amongst everyone of how you will be searching for that next new person and what criteria you'll be evaluating the candidates against. I would say executive session comes into play once you're discussing the candidates, their employment history, what you thought of them during the interview process. That would be an appropriate use of executive session.
Rebecca, as a follow-up to that, since we're talking executive session anyway, a question came in. So you mentioned the process for new executive director. How about salary increases for the director or staff?
So I'm going to say that depends. It depends on if the salary discussion is tied to a performance appraisal. So if you had done an evaluation, let's say, of your director, and then you wanted to have a discussion about the salary increase as it related to the performance appraisal, that could be done in executive session. But if you're just talking about what will the salary increases look like for the staff in general next year, that actually would be done in an open session. That's public information about public money and how it will be spent. But when tied to a specific person and their performance, that is appropriate to use executive session.
And I think we've talked about that before through previous discussions, and Jerry's big on this too, is like library directors are always in executive session with their board and helping them facilitate those discussions and being part of those discussions, with the exception of when it comes down to the performance evaluation of the executive director, as well as potentially the determination of the salary. Yeah, I think that's good. All right, so next question. This kind of ties to board meeting minutes and open meetings law. Do you have to wait until board meetings have been approved to be posted to the library's website?
No, in fact, you probably procedurally can't. The open meetings law process requires you to post a draft of your minutes within 2 weeks of your meeting. So again, draft. And then once they're approved at your next board meeting, you can change your archive on your website to have the approved version. But it's fine to have the draft. And in fact, you probably would have to, because you wouldn't likely meet again in 2 weeks. And then there's a strange little caveat to the law that indicates if you did an executive session at that meeting and you made a decision in executive session, you have to publish minutes of the executive session a week later. And that can complicate things in particular situations. So just be aware of that attribute of the minutes requirement. Draft in 2 minutes. That's right, Kathleen.
So this one, I remember talking with the group, the editorial board, about this one when it came up, Rebecca. Is the annual sexual harassment training a requirement or a recommendation for trustees?
It's a requirement. Full stop.
And it's fun to see all the OSC audits that are coming out right now that are talking about the sexual harassment prevention training, and trustees for lots of different areas are listed directly in there as people who need to take that training.
Yeah, and for folks who don't know what OSC audits are, the Office of the State Comptroller has the right to audit public libraries on your financial procedures. Many of you are probably familiar with that aspect, but they're now authorized and required to audit agencies across the state of all types, so association and public libraries, of whether or not you have hit the requirements for sexual harassment prevention training. So there's a bad headline for you if you mess that one up.
Oh, good.
And I'll just throw this out here. I don't think the questions come through yet, but sexual harassment prevention training required for trustees. New York State legislated trustee training also required for trustees. One does not get you credit for the other. So you can't, your sexual harassment prevention training does not count towards your legislated library trustee training. And the only other thing I'll say about the sexual harassment prevention training for trustees, they're the ones that approve the sexual harassment prevention policy for the organization. And, you know, so volunteers, paid staff, the executive director, they're all responsible for taking that training as it applies to how they work with the public and third-party vendors coming into the library. So I think just modeling that good behavior, not only just because it's legislated, but just modeling the good behavior on the policy that you approve is a really good idea.
Nice.
So yeah, we're all over the place, but this is fun stuff. So
yeah. It's like a game show.
My brain's going left to right now. Should all the library's policies be published to the library's website?
That's a great question. Thank you to whoever asked that. You should be publishing any policy that interacts with the public, so the public actually knows what the policy is. That would be great. And then I would say any of the, let me see if I can just pull this up really quick for you, but any of the policies that are noted as required from the state library, and I pulled this up in anticipation of this coming up today, so it won't take me long to put it into the chat for everybody. But Ron, why don't you talk about this, because you were on the task force that helped with this, but there's a new list now of required policies from the state library.
So if you go to the helpful information for meeting minimum standards list on the state website, which oh yeah, right there, Rebecca, perfect. That's great. In here, there's actually a list of all the different policies that are required for library registration, and those are the ones that are considered quote unquote required, the ones that your library should have. In Rebecca's list for recommended policy in the trustee handbook, having those ones, those policies are going to protect your library as much as possible. If you're looking for the ones maybe that if you're missing some that you want to prioritize first, looking at this list is going to be really great. And on there's the open meetings policy, confidentiality of library records, conflict of interest. We've known we needed that one for a while. Whistleblower policy for certain organizations. Disaster response policy. Rebecca mentioned the collection development policy that we had an attorney develop for us, which is linked in the handbook. Meeting space policy, if you have space in your library. Internet use policy, so the standards of what people can do on the internet in your building. Code of ethics is really important one to have as well. And we have a trustee code of ethics that we love to review every year just to make sure that our trustees have a good understanding of what their ethical obligations are at our organization. Personnel policy, so those employee handbooks that describe what it is to work for your organization. And then all those financial control policy, which those ones, Rebecca mentioned the Office of State Comptroller earlier. We learned a lot from all the audits that happened in libraries and the financial controls that are required that libraries should be looking at. So this is purchasing, procurement, petty cash policies. So all these ones are really important policies for you to prioritize, have at your organization, and then work your way through the rest of the items that are on that recommended checklist.
And so just to go back to the origin of this, the question was what policies to have on your website. Most important are those that intersect with the public. So patron code of conduct, internet use, meeting room use, those things that help facilitate the public's interaction with your library and its services. Those are the priority to get on the website. But I would also say a lot of the ones that we just gave you the link to would probably be good to have on your site as well.
And there's also a bunch of, oh, sorry, Brian, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I think in addition to having that requirement of on your library's website, people engage with your library in very different ways. So you are probably serving patrons that never walk into your building. And so old school, we used to provide policies at the circulation desk or the reference desk in print, being transparent with our community members, making those policies available to them. But, putting them up on your website makes certain that people that maybe are just using your online collections, your databases, that's how they're engaging with your library. So making sure that they're up there. And also it's just being transparent, making sure that they're available. And we've talked about it in other ways when it comes to questions from the community. It's just so much easier administratively and for staff to be able to share out those documents. If you're receiving an inquiry from a community member about a specific policy, let's say your collection management policy or your challenge to library materials policy, instead of trying to find that document somewhere on a hard drive within the library or in the cloud, you just reference the link to your library's website and just put it out there, and it's real easy for you to answer those questions.
And on that page, the helpful information for the policy standard, there's a really helpful tip in there, and Rebecca posted the link earlier for the sample public library policies on the Mid-Hudson website. The helpful tip is it's a good idea to start with a sample and then adapt it to your library specific need. No need to recreate the wheel with a lot of these policies. You can find a template, read through it, and see exactly what applies to your organization, and then develop it from there.
So I'll just share that I also put the helpful information for minimum standards from the state library on what you should have on your website completely, not just from your policy standpoint, but all of the things that are required from the minimum standards. And I also gave you the link to the sexual harassment prevention model policy and training. The training has actually for free been done by New York State. You can just use that if you didn't want to pay for that from another provider.
Rebecca, this is kind of a general question, so I'm going to fill in the blank a little bit on it. But the question is, who is responsible for orientations? And I'm going to broaden it to say, who's responsible for orienting the new director, and then who's responsible for orienting new trustees as they're appointed or elected to your board?
That's a good question. I'm going to tackle the trustee one first because that's easier. I think that usually boards, it's going to be a combination of a committee of your board and the director is helping create the orientation process and delivering it. At the very least, it should be the director and board president are sitting down with a new trustee and walking them through things and setting expectations and giving them helpful reference material. Often boards will also have a board development committee that helps with recruitment, evaluation, and that onboarding process for new board members. And there might be volunteers from that committee that help with that. But I say it can look different depending on your situation, but those are some of the common ways I've seen that be done. Now, the orientation of your library director, that is very different because that is your leader. It's a professional that may or may not have been a director before. So it could look very different depending on, I've got a new director in my system. She was a longtime library director in another system. She came over here to my system. Our orientation took me about half the time that it takes me with someone who's never been a director before. So I think your orientation to the organization, your library, will probably be done by a team, right? It depends on how much documentation was left by the previous director. Was there any overlap with the previous director? How large is your staff that's going to help out with onboarding that new person, as well as some help from the trustees. They're going to help with background information, meeting people in the community. So again, another team effort there, but it's going to look a little different depending on the experience level of your director.
And I'll just add on a personal note, as somebody who's been a director at 3 different places on 3 different occasions, if the board president can meet you at the library on the very first day to shake your hand and welcome you and, work with staff to walk you around and introduce you to folks, that is one of the greatest ways that board president and director relationship can get started on the right foot.
That's such a good point, Brian. One of my directors here in Mid-Hudson, again, you all know I'm writing a book when I retire called The Library That Shall Not Be Named. So I'm not going to out them. But she started on her first day. No one was there to welcome her. And there was a bid opening and no one told her. So she had an exciting first day.
That's a big one for the first day to have
Yeah.
a bid opening. Whew.
All right, so straight and to the point, going down the realm of technology and digital equity, do individual libraries apply for E-rate funding?
It can depend on which system you're in. Some of the library systems in the state have assistance for doing that with you or do it for you. Other systems don't have that capacity, so each library can do it on their own. But I would say start by calling your system to see what resources are available to you. At the very least, it'll be a friendly voice to decode the process for you probably on the other end of the line, if not someone who can help you fill out the forms or do it for you.
Yeah, and I'll just say from a perspective of working in a library system where we coordinate that on behalf of our member libraries as a cooperative library system, if you are an individual library and you have needs that are above and beyond what the system currently provides, talk with your system about that. Systems are in a continuous revolving cycle and updating, whether that's different categories of E-rate funding, either for equipment or for broadband connectivity. And so there is opportunities for cooperative library systems or library systems that are doing it on behalf of the libraries to include specialized things for individual libraries, as long as it aligns with what their E-rate plan is. So definitely keep your voice loud and talk with your library systems. And I can assure you your library system is going to work with you on it.
All right. Here's one about board meeting agendas. And this is about the documentation that you had mentioned earlier, Rebecca. So is the monthly board meeting agenda considered a discussion document? If so, could we just post the major headings of the agenda? Often our committees provide a summary and we include the agenda, but usually less than 24 hours before the meeting. Board members review it and discuss it only if there are questions.
That's a good one. I'll take this opportunity to mention that your board packet should be done about a week in advance of your board meeting, which would require an agenda to be there to serve as kind of the table of contents for the board packet, right? That refers to the items that will be discussed and in which order. So I would say normally the agenda is posted in advance, particularly 24 hours in advance, but it certainly could just be, item A, approval of agenda. Item B, approval of the minutes. There doesn't have to be the detail underneath it. That perhaps it sounds like you're doing maybe an annotated version of your agenda. I don't think you'd have to use that unless it had the actual input from the committee that was going to be discussed, like a mini committee report was being embedded in your agenda document. Then yeah, you would have to share that at least 24 hours in advance.
I'm good with that one. How do you go about getting pilots? And Rebecca, I know you kind of talked through it and you talked about a case study as well, but do you have any additional advice on that?
So again, it's something that we can't answer for every single library, but I would say that if there are pilots that have been negotiated in your town or region, there's a very good chance that public libraries are eligible for those. So figuring out which agency negotiated it and then giving them a call and asking the question would be the easiest way to start. It's not something like you apply for to get them. They are negotiated by two other agencies, and you happen to be perhaps the beneficiary of that negotiation if they are in place in your region. And this is why we had Jerry redo the primer for that and added it to the trustee handbook, because it is the only place I've ever found information about it is the research Jerry did for an article he wrote for some journal like over 20 years ago. So we dusted that off and updated it for the trustee handbook.
The first time I heard about pilots was from Jerry. He
Yeah.
had brought it up in the Long Island University class that I took with him. So
Same.
good stuff.
Yeah, I would say check with your local library system. I mean, most library systems are in touch with their, economic development corporations and having those conversations already in place, or they might know something that's coming down the line that not everybody knows about. But yeah, they're helpful if you don't have a lot of libraries with pilots, but those that do really take advantage of them.
All right. So this one is coming in from Leslie Shaw, who's actually in my system. So hey, Leslie, how are you? And questions are always specific enough, so no need to worry about that. So Leslie comes from a small library, and they've been thinking about the number of subcommittees of the board that could exist to fulfill the responsibilities. So is this simply a matter of deal with it, or is the size kind of precludes us from this? So I guess the question is there such a thing as a library that's too small to have subcommittees of the board, or too large to have a lot of subcommittees of the board? How does that work with the number of trustees versus the subcommittees?
I think it's challenging for libraries with small boards, right? You've got the minimum number of trustees in a library in New York State is 5. If you have a 5-member board, it's not much you can do to divvy up the same people over and over again into committees, right? So we have to confront the laws of physics. So I think that when you look at the standard standing committees that you'll see in the handbook, it's still possible to have committees. They're going to be small, maybe committee of 2 to focus in on things. But you also may have already, usually you'll see the smaller size boards with the libraries that have larger budgets and more staff. So it's more likely that you have professional staff or consultants that are helping with things that in a smaller library setting, you'd have to convene a committee to figure out. So that's where you'll see the larger library boards are more likely with a smaller library, and particularly smaller association libraries, because you do more with little. So I think that your mileage may vary, but you do have to consider proper oversight, how to keep your meetings running well, and the appropriate use of committees in those 2 arenas of oversight and keeping meetings running smoothly. I certainly know of 5-member boards where there are no committees and they just are super efficient and their director is highly organized and they are able to get things done in their 1 meeting a month. But I think it's challenging, and you have to have a very skilled director to make that happen well.
Yeah, and I think we've learned through these discussions. I mean, a lot of the work can happen within those committees. Like Rebecca said, you dig a little bit deeper within those committee discussions about something that's very specific and focused, like policy development or looking at the finances, or, and how those things kind of sometimes intersect, whether it be through a capital fund policy or developing the budget. But like, I think sometimes, when the work gets done within those committees, it does make that board meeting a lot easier to go through. I just think I had a board meeting today and it was wonderful. We had had 4 different committees. Everybody kind of worked through and shared out what work took place over the last 4 weeks between one regular board meeting to the next. And it was super efficient when we got to that regular meeting where we were in and out in 60 minutes, but we had covered a lot of ground in a very short period of time. All right, next question. And this ties back to one of your earlier slides, Rebecca, on risk management. And I like this question a lot because it's something that's a lot of librarians and directors are concerned about today. What role do trustees play in making sure the library is preparing for emergency type situations?
So I think we need to create a pattern of higher level of involvement. I've been really studying this issue for the past few years as it's really come home to roost, understanding the climate hazards of our region and understanding we're going to see more severe weather impacting our regions or various regions of New York. But the variety of the types of emergencies that can happen it's a little daunting. So I think that emergency preparedness work or disaster preparedness work is kind of everyone's responsibility. You have a different perspective as a trustee, perhaps, than the library director and the staff do. But as a library trustee, I think you want to make sure you've got appropriate insurance coverage and participate perhaps in some activities along with the staff, thinking through the most likely disasters that could hit your library and thinking through what would we have if we went through that. What would we wish we had known, right? And just doing scenario planning and working through that. And I think trustees can be a valuable asset in those conversations to help think things through. Do we have the right policy? Do we have the right insurance coverage? Do we actually have our emergency action plan, which that acronym EAP, there's 2 EAPs in our world. There's the Employee Assistance Program, which might be an HR resource you purchase for your library staff. But there's also a mandated emergency action plan that you are required to have as an employer under OSHA. And so that emergency action plan should cover most of the general kind of disasters that could befall your library, and has your evacuation plan and what to do if the power goes out and some of those basic things that we just all accept that happens in our lives. But there are some new things that have to be added onto that. Active shooter training needs to be added onto that. Thinking about extended power outages needs to be added there. So I think that risk management area, we need as many brains thinking about it as possible, because the variety of what could happen could be overwhelming to folks. So we need to narrow it down to the most likely hazards and then make sure we have a plan in place to deal with those hazards.
One of the when I read this question, my mind went probably to the latter part of your discussion, and whether it be active shooter trainings or just safety of library staff within the building. We work in 75% of our libraries are fairly rural, remote, and so there's a lot of instances where we have a director or a staff member who's in the building by themselves during certain hours of library operations. And so from a board member's perspective, facility audit, what does your facility look like, and how are you accessing New York State Public Library construction aid to make sure that you have security cameras available within your building, making sure that there's proper and ample lighting both within inside the building as well as outside the building at all points of egress to where staff are walking to their cars within the parking lot. And then also from a policy development standpoint, like what is like the phone chain look like in terms of when that person's alone, and the emergency procedures in place for calling somebody to let people who are in the building know, yes, you might be alone, but you're not really alone. And then the last thing I always think about from a trustee's responsibility perspective is just looking at your funding. Really, we live in a world today in civic spaces, or at least public spaces, where staff should not be alone in a building. And so, how do we make sure that we're securing adequate funding so that we mitigate that risk completely by making sure that there's 2 people in the building, or working with our volunteer base so that there's a volunteer in the building when there's a staff member in the building. So like Rebecca said, there's one approach to this, and when we're thinking about disaster preparedness and emergency planning, but there's that other approach of just safety and wellness for staff members in the building, working on the front lines with a very diverse group of community members.
If I could just add to that, Brian, I think the training aspect of it too, here at Mid-Hudson, we realized the power went out one day when I was here and my facilities guy wasn't. And I totally was like, what are our procedures for this? Like, we got to drill sometimes. Like, and we were like, oh yeah, we haven't done an evacuation drill in a very long time either. We actually had like a gas leak in the auditorium, and like, Central Hudson showed up, our utility showed up, and they're like, yeah, there's a gas leak. I'm like, okay, let's all go, folks. And then we had a review with our supervisors. We need to know where the staff are. We need to have a meeting spot where we all meet up and we know everyone's safe. And the practice of those things is important because as you are confronted, and many of you have been in crisis situations yourselves, you know, some people's brains do not operate the same as others in those moments, and they might completely just freak out. And so folks that can remain calm or organized enough to help others, the more practice they have, the better off we're all going to be in those situations.
Thanks, Rebecca and Brian. So this next question, it might need a little bit of a definition and then some explanation. So Teresa asks, can the board use majority vote when not in quorum?
No. You can't conduct business unless you have a quorum. So you need to have a quorum at least. And if you only have a quorum, you're going to need those votes to be unanimous to pass.
And a quorum is a majority of the whole, including vacancies.
Correct.
So just keep that in mind. It's in the handbook, so pretty easy to find on that one as well.
All right, we got a planning question. How do you refresh your planning process so we get long-term trustees excited about planning?
It's all you, Ron.
You should watch the workshop that we did on for the trustee handbook book club. I feel like that was a fun one. There's also there's lots of planning videos in the where I think there's 3 of them that are listed specifically in the trustee handbook. And I mention these because I think in order to get people excited about planning, you have to figure out what your planning potential can be at your library. And yes, it's a minimum standard, of course, you know, you have to have a long range plan, but I think the ability for trustees to come together and collectively look out into the future and say, that's where we want to go is a really cool thing to think about as a group. When you think about what the vision of your organization is, when you think about what potential goals you could set and accomplish over the next 3 to 5 years, I think that's a really nice thing. So in order to get people excited about planning or to get individuals involved with coming up with those types of things, design your structure or how you're going to plan as a library. You can base it off of what's in the handbook, but consider it not as a standard, but as like, what can we do to make this organization cool? Not everything has to be, we need to expand this, or we need to continue this, or we need to grow this. Think about what is going to be hugely impactful for your organization in the community. Take a look at the Library Transform guidebook for the questions that you can ask people within your community. There are get out of the space where what the library has traditionally done and think about what is it that we can do that's going to be so impactful. I think that planning can be really inspiring, but the process itself has to be inspiring in order to get inspiration out of it. So meet with your board, talk excitedly about it, say we're going to follow these things, figure out what you're going to do, assign things to the planning committee if you have one, or different trustees, get them out of the library, talking to the leaders in your community, the public in your community, and see what they're thinking about for your organization. So be inspirational and you'll get inspiration out of it, I guess. But use the foundation that's in the handbook, as well as some of the workshops that are in there. Rebecca and I had that great conversation for the trustee handbook book club a few sessions ago. The recordings on the Mid-Hudson Library website. You can watch that. Watch it together with your board to really kind of figure out how you want to structure your planning process to get the most out of it.
I think Ron likes planning.
I love planning. I think it's such a cool thing to think about. Here's where we are now, and how can we, as just this small group of people, make such a really cool impact in our community. I think there's so much potential in there that it's really good. If you think planning's boring, just I don't know, just give me a call and I'll change about it. I love it. I think it's really great. Oh, we got some laughing emojis on that. So I like planning. What can I
It
do?
was tears. I wasn't sure if it was laughter or tears, Ron.
Fair enough. Did you,
I love the emojis. I get excited when I see them.
yeah, yeah. Rebecca or Brian, did you have anything else you wanted to add to that one?
You can't add on perfection, Ron.
All right, fair enough, fair enough. Whew, thank you. All right. This one is going back to looks like we need a little clarification on executive session minutes specifically. So Susan's asking, can you explain the minutes of an executive session? And I guess I'll add, how would you describe those? How are they different from your standard minutes that you have from an open meeting?
So the first thing to understand is that you don't have to take minutes in your executive session unless you have a vote in executive session. So if you go into executive session to discuss the library director's performance evaluation, you have a conversation, you come to consensus, everything's good, we're good here, we leave, you don't take any minutes. No minutes are required. If you went in and you decided to sell property, you were talking with your lawyer, what are our rights, blah, blah, blah. And we held a vote in executive session. Yes, we're going to sell the property. You'd have to produce minutes within a week that says the board voted to sell this property within 1 week, right? So you'd have 1 week to strategize, talk to real estate agent, get your act together before perhaps doing this. So you have to be highly strategic when you take a vote in executive session, because the cone of silence or privacy in the executive session basically expires about a week after if you vote. If you don't vote, no minutes necessary. All people know is the reason why you went into executive session. So, I usually advise our library boards to don't vote in executive session, take the vote outside of executive session, or agree to perhaps postpone until you have the information you need, or you have all your ducks lined up to go live basically with information. So you have to be very strategic in that respect. But again, no minutes necessary if no votes are taken in executive session.
Like all over the place. It's like I feel like I'm in control of what direction this conversation is going right now.
You are.
Yeah. This one ties back to public relations, but also crosses over with handling library material challenges. Is there a resource out there to handle library material challenges from a public relations perspective?
There are some excellent resources, actually, and the number one resource is the American Library Association's Office for Intellectual Freedom. They have lawyers on staff that can coach you through something if you can already tell it's going to be highly controversial. So that if you are an ALA member or not, they open their doors to you, which is pretty generous. And as someone who has worked with those folks a couple of times, they are top notch and they have seen it all. Deborah Caldwell Stone in particular, the head of the Office of Intellectual Freedom, is just literally, in my book, a national treasure for the guidance she has provided to libraries across the country during challenges. So that's the big guns. Like when you can see the folks with pitchforks come into your board meeting, that's when you call that hotline. So on the American Library Association's website, you're looking for the Office of Intellectual Freedom. That's for like your hotline, like the bat signal when you really need that kind of help. Of course, your system is going to be available to advise you, but there's also lots of nice resources from Unite Against Book Bans, which is a public campaign really to help find all the people who believe in defending the right to read. There's lots of nice resources on their website. Again, Unite Against Book Bans, to help you manage these situations. But I'd really reflect back on that internal policy. How you handle an initial challenge when it comes in might be the biggest PR decision you make in this entire process, because a lot of times when you handle it well and follow your policy and use a calm and common sense demeanor, it can diffuse the situation right off the bat, and you never get to the heightened kind of need for the bat signal to go out to Deborah over at ALA in Chicago. So think about that continuum of the process and where the PR help is going to be needed. I think you need your crisis communication or your PR policy to make it clear who the spokesperson is for the library, but that policy is actually, and that process for the request for reconsideration is what protects you most in this moment and should be considered a PR tool. Ron and Brian, do you have other tools you point people to on this topic?
has gone through 2 fairly public challenges with over the month of December and November 2023, and it ties back to like 6 policies, and I'll kind of say them in order and slowly. First is your collection management policy. Make sure that it's current and up to date and reflects guidance of the lawyers that Rebecca was just talking about. Your challenge to library materials policy, as well as the request for reconsideration form that accompanies that policy. So those are the second and third documents you really want to take a look at. Your public comment policy, so how you handle yourselves within a public hearing when community members are present and asking questions about the materials that they're questioning. And then also your public communications policy, which is that 5th policy. That kind of ties back to the original question that was asked here, making sure that you recognize who within the library can answer questions to the media and kind of like help steer the message and the conversation within the community. And the last one is your social media policy. You know, regardless of whether you're a small library or big policy or a big library, if you're experiencing a challenge, you're going to have stuff that comes up on social media because you're going to be advertising public meetings or public hearings, and you open yourself up to, you know, comments from the community. And so just take a look at those 6 documents that I just referenced right there. And like Rebecca said, that's the core. And if you've got those tight and everybody's well educated on them, both at the board level, your director, and then also staff, and you should be in good shape. And then also practice. So we talked about emergency procedures and disaster preparedness and safety. If you've got some scripts in hand, some library systems have been developing scripts for staff to use with their director to practice when somebody comes up to the circulation desk and poses a challenge or asks for a request for reconsideration form. How does staff handle that? No differently than they handle any other complaint within the library. And then also practice it in a board meeting. What does it look like when you have an angered community member about a material that's on the shelf and you're there in a public session answering or maybe not answering those questions based on your public comment policy? So I think that's kind of where the places that you start.
That was great, Brian.
And talk to your public library system. They've probably been looking at this to some extent. And Rebecca mentioned the Unite Against Book Bans resource. And just recently, they released kind of a connected resource, which is the book resumes. And that's really a cool resource to look at, too, where it says resume because it's a really short document on these different books that have been challenged across the nation and what the reasons are for that, what they're challenged. It has some resources in there about the reviews of it. It has age levels in it. It's a really interesting resource to take a look at if you're curious about finding more about what these book challenges are and what people are saying about it. All right, Rebecca, this one comes from an anonymous attendee. It's a little ominous. Can you remove a trustee for not attending meetings? It looks like this one specifically has some family issues, but it looks like some ongoing absences. So can you talk on that one a little bit?
Sure. So education law allows for the automatic removal if a trustee misses 3 consecutive meetings unexcused, meaning they didn't bother to call you or say anything. They just don't show up. So if they're 3 in a row in that manner, they're out anyway. You just remove them from the board. If you got someone with chronic attendance problems, I would first suggest that your board president have a talk with them and explain the option to perhaps take a leave of absence or resign and come back when their life situation has created the opportunity to make room for volunteering on the board again. But again, if you've got someone who has chronic problem attending, your board president has spoken to them about it, and we're still having chronic attendance problems, then you could move into dereliction of duty language. So that's why it's important. You might remember a few minutes ago, Ron mentioned the trustee code of ethics. That document is a good one to be reviewing with boards every single year to remind people of our responsibility as trustees. You'll see in the beginning of the trustee handbook a message from the state librarian who cites the language from the Board of Regents, which is the oversight agency for all library boards across the land in New York. That is the body that can remove board members or an entire board that is not up to snuff in terms of carrying out their duties. So you should have language from that document in your code of ethics policy for your trustees. So you have a leg to stand on when you need to deal with behavior like this, right? As Ron and Brian were saying before in the last answer, your policies are the kind of leverage you need sometimes to deal with these situations. What that means, you need to review them regularly. They need to actually have the power that you need them to have embedded in them. But usually that conversation between the board president and the person is the license for that person to step away. So I would say don't be afraid to have that conversation with the person. They may be just trying to be everything for everyone, and they're looking for someone to give them permission to step away. That's been my experience when I've helped libraries in that situation. Usually that person's been so relieved to understand they won't be leaving the board in a lurch. But I also understand there's some personalities where that's not the case. They are truly just trying to save that space for themselves, but not actually do the work.
All right, and I'm going to build on that question with the one that actually ties back to the new legislation with trustee training. It comes from Sharon. Can the board establish non-completion of trustee training as a criterion for removal from the board?
Yes.
Yeah.
Actually, and I'll thank Laura Chrissy, who's helping us out here tonight, for pointing this out. On the state library's website, they have a really helpful page. I'm going to put it in the chat for you, that has a sample trustee education policy. And in it is the lever to use that as part of the reason that someone could be dismissed from the board. That is a law. Trustee education requirements is a state law, so violating it could be cause for removal from the board, and your policy should probably reflect that. Maybe there's a progressive discipline path, but that would be the ultimate end of that path.
I think it goes back to like a lot of the reasons why we're here tonight. It goes back to the basics, like the very first trustee handbook book club session that we had, which was on duties and responsibilities and just duty of care, like making certain that like we're upholding duty of care, duty of obedience, duty of responsibility. It's 2 hours. And, many of you are signing off on your annual statistical reports to the state education department right now. And there's a box that you have to check that the full board. So the full board is in compliance, and that means that each individual trustee took 2 hours of trustee training. And, for all of you that are here, I know I'm already kind of preaching to the folks that know that this is their responsibility, but, incorporating those into your bylaws as well as your code of ethics statements and, developing the policy around trustee education requirements. I think all those 3 documents and then upholding those 3 duties is really what's going to guide you through, helping trustees understand that it's really important to participate in this training.
Rebecca, does the whole board have to be involved in the evaluation of the director? It seems a bit overwhelming for that director.
Well, I think at some level, every trustee has a touch point in the process. So taking a look at your process might involve a couple of different steps. You're first setting the expectations for the director and to let them know what they will be evaluated against. We should all agree on that as a board. And then there's the actual mechanics of the process, which might involve a form that the director and members of the board are filling out and a discussion of the results of that with the director. So I would say that in setting the expectations and what the director would be evaluated against, all board members are agreeing on that. The mechanics of the process, of course, agreeing on the form that would be used. It would be recommended by a committee of your board and agreed to by the board and director. Carrying out the activities that come next can look a little different depending on what process you're using. But let's use the hypothetical situation that I just laid out there. So for example, the way I am evaluated, all of my trustees fill out a form to help evaluate me against my job description and the strategic goals of my organization. And then those are aggregated. And then my board president has a chat with me about the results there. And then in an executive session, the results are also shared out and I join them for that conversation. So I think there's different aspects of being involved. So not every trustee is involved in every component of that, but you certainly want to have a say over what the director is going to be evaluated against and get the chance to give your perspective on how things are going.
Abilities of director and board, in your opinion, Rebecca.
So Brian, your audio was just cut out for the beginning part of that. Could you repeat it for me?
What are the most important shared responsibilities of director and board?
What are the most important? Well, I think the financial stewardship of the organization is probably right up there. You both have roles to play in that work. Setting the strategic direction of the organization is going to be pretty important, and policy making is going to be very important. If we can get those three things right as a team, then we go to our separate corners and do our work as the manager and the governing body of the organization, and most of the other stuff will work out. But if you don't have the finances, the strategic direction, and the policies in place, things go sideways really quickly. Would you add to those?
Yeah, the only other one I would add is board meetings. And I think that, and I know that it's the board's responsibility to run those meetings, but I think that the director does a lot of facilitation to make sure that they're organized and well run, both committee meetings and board meetings. But when that question came through, I thought about the diagram that you guys have in the trustee handbook and working together. And I mean, you hit the nail right on the head that it was probably those three things: policy development, strategic planning, and financial house.
And something I just want to clarify for people. I saw a question come through before. The print version of the handbook is out there, and your systems most likely have copies for you. The online version is a little weird. The state library has not finished translating the print version into what they call their LibGuide version of the trustee handbook. So there's only a PDF available, which the link was shared in the chat before, from the state library's catalog that's available online right now. So please be careful when you're on the state library's website. If you're looking at the LibGuide version of the trustee handbook, that's the old version. They've promised me it's going to be done next month, but I've heard that like 6 months running. So just be careful when you're on the state library's website. And when Brian mentioned refer to that working together chart, make sure you've got either the print copy in hand or the PDF version that your system shares with you.
And this is kind of a follow-up question. And I don't think we've answered it yet, but they wanted there was a trustee that wanted to know, somewhere in this long line of thread of questions, should we hold on to the other trustee handbook, the 2018, with all of our notes and stuff in it?
Only you can make that call. I have no idea what your notes are and what things you've learned along the way that might be helpful to you, but hopefully most of it you can transfer to the new handbook.
I say start over, write all your notes in this one, because some of your notes may be outdated. I would compare the two, get it. I've already started marking up my copy of it, Rebecca, with all my things that I want to make sure that I tell libraries when I'm talking to them. So that's how I see it.
I don't know if this makes me cry or makes me joyful, but I've already started making notes for the next edition. So
Oh man.
I know.
Plus, look at the nice color that it is. Like, this
know.
is gorgeous. Did you pick this out,
pretty.
Rebecca?
I did. I fought hard for it. Jerry wanted orange. I said no.
Okay, Rebecca, speaking of the handbook, on page 37, there's a bunch of committees that are listed. Are those the only committees that libraries should have, or can we have different ones?
You can have different ones. Page 37, which I'm flipping to right now to refresh my memory of what it says. Board committees. There's standard committees, right, that we see most libraries have, but you may need something a little different. Every library is a little different. But I think there's some core activities that are well served by committees. So that's what you see reflected. Really, if you flip to the sample bylaws in the appendix is where you see the list of standing committees that are recommended. But you could combine some of those into a board operations committee and have a couple of them under that one if you've got a smaller board. And you could add something. It'd be great in your bylaws to have a clause to allow the creation of what we call ad hoc committees, as needed committees, which might be temporary committees to deal with a particular topic or project or issue, and they sunset once they're no longer needed. So I'd say you have to craft what works best for you, but those are the most common standing committees that we've come across.
All right. An anonymous attendee asks, if a trustee is presenting several price quotes for consideration at a board meeting, do these quotes have to be published 24 hours to the meeting as well?
So that's an interesting one, because normally that activity wouldn't happen at a board meeting. So I guess you'd want to first have your procurement policy, review that to make sure it's actually up to date, and thinking through that process of how you would do it. But normally it wouldn't be until the final choice has been made by a committee or the director that would be presented to the board and yes, published in your board packet. But publishing all of them, it seems inefficient to me, but I guess it could happen.
All right. So Rebecca, earlier you had mentioned putting documents on the library website 24 hours before a board meeting. Is there a rule on how long those need to stay up there? Should we replace them when the documents are approved or updated? How does that work?
No, there's no information from the Committee on Open Government of how long they have to be there, just the front end of the process, 24 hours in advance of your meeting. And then you could probably take it down after the meeting, because then you're also required now to post those minutes of the meeting to your website, which is the report of that meeting. So in that document, it might refer to certain documents. You'd want to make sure those were probably still publicly available. In my organization, we find it easier just to leave the packet there for people to refer to. And then the minutes are kept separately and people can refer to the documents. We number the documents now, which has become incredibly valuable. So when I wrote my board minutes from Saturday's board meeting, and when I refer to my report, it's document 6. And so people can easily find that in the packet to refer back to.
We started doing that too, just because some of our meetings are so heavy. We got a lot of stuff. So it helps trustees figure out where they're going to go. And I also put in there, what action are we planning on taking? Is this something that needs to be approved? Is this something that just needs to be talked about? What is it that trustees should expect as they're reviewing that board packet a week in advance when it's sent out, as Rebecca said earlier?
And I'll just share another little pro tip that we do here at Mid-Hudson. On the agenda, we put an asterisk next to anything that needs a board vote. So there's no question. We know exactly what to do. The board president's facilitation goes so much smoother because he knows exactly where we need to have those votes. It just makes the meeting go a little smoother, which as you know, that can save time, which is wonderful.
All right, I think we're getting down to the last thread of questions here. I don't think we've asked this. I'm sorry, we're a little less organized tonight, Ron, but the questions are good. Can a board have a meeting without the director, not a required meeting? I feel like we've answered a lot of this through open meetings law.
So I want to make sure I understand the question, Brian. Can a board have like an official board meeting without the director there?
Yeah.
You could, but I got to say it'd be a really bad idea. So the director is certainly not required to be there, but as the co-leader of your organization, who has much of the technical knowledge you need to get through that agenda, and also as the person who has to carry out the actions that you take, you'd want them there firsthand to both participate and hear the board's wishes. So I would not recommend it, but technically, yeah, you could, but you'll pay a price for it.
Yeah, I think when I first started as a system director, I'd learned of some directors that the board had them come to the board meeting, deliver their director report, and then they were excused afterwards. But it's an open meeting, so I would assume that the director could be there anyways. And so, you know, and you also heard us advocate for the fact that a director should be, you know, not only at every board meeting, but they should also be in every executive session, with the exception of maybe when the board is talking about the evaluation of the director or the salary of the director. So. Ron, do you have any more in your queue? I'm trying to pull stuff together.
Yeah, it looks like Brian, I think we have time for one more.
Yeah.
And I got one. And this is one that we've answered before when we were talking about open meetings law. And I know this is Rebecca's favorite question. Do committee meetings need to follow open meetings law, even if the committee's small?
Okay, so good question. So the first thing to answer is, what type of library are you? If you're an association library, the answer is no, your committees are not required to follow open meetings law, but it's a good idea because you get a lot of public funding. But for public libraries, your committee meetings do fall under open meetings law, and the committee meetings need to be announced and run just like a regular board meeting would. And that is for any committee of 2 board members or more. So even if you have like community members serving in an advisory capacity, anytime you've got 2 trustees on a committee, it triggers open meetings law for public libraries.
All right, I think that has brought us to the end of our first session for 2024. I want to thank the 200 plus trustees that joined us here this evening. I just realized this tonight, guys, this is our 4th year of doing the Trustee Handbook Book Club. We're going our 4th year.
Wow.
And we've got dozens of sessions. I put together an email that I'm sending out to our membership on Sunday, try to do a bi-weekly email, and made sure I listed out every single recording we've done, and we've got a lot out there, a lot of different topics. And so we couldn't have done that without all of you who are joining us here tonight. Thank you so much for staying strong and, following us and being involved in this wonderful journey that both Rebecca, Ron, and I, and Laura and Jerry have loved being part of and doing. And, thank you to Rebecca and Jerry for, taking the lead on getting us going with this back and, just coming out of the pandemic to get things going. So we just want to thank everybody for joining us for this installment of the Trustee Handbook Book Club. We always enjoy your company. We hope you'll continue to follow us throughout 2024. Upcoming discussions will take place June 18th and October 15th. Those are all Tuesdays, and they begin at 5 o'clock, just like all the other ones have. And you can register for those events on Mid-Hudson Library System's website, www.midhudson.org/trustee book club. That link has been shared multiple times here tonight. You'll also find all of our previous recordings and sessions located within that location. And don't miss our next one, which is going to take place in June. It's going to focus on libraries for the future, an introduction to sustainability as the newest core value. You definitely don't want to miss this one. In the meantime, please know you are in good company. We have this amazing community of libraries throughout New York State that all travel down the same path each day. Lean on your library systems, your neighboring libraries, and each other to do the good work. We love doing this work with you, and we thank all of our trustees across New York State for helping make public librarianship possible. It's wonderful to be part of, and we hope all of you have a wonderful night. Until we meet again, be well and stay safe.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.